So we were going over the study for your Constitution test, and this is a really good in the back of your book here, and that you can get all the information you need for a test on the Constitution. But I'm going over, and I went over the whole Constitution in the last two videos, and now I'm going to go over the Bill of Rights. So, and I'm not going to read, I'm just going to tell you what they're about, and you can read it for yourself. So the Bill of Rights, we're going to go through. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments. They call that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. And these amendments are protect the citizens against the excessive power of the federal government. So the Bill of Rights are our rights against the government's power. So the First Amendment is the main. You always think, that's my First Amendment right? And that, of course, all of these, these were in 1791. It tells the date. The First Amendment. What's the First Amendment? Congress cannot set up a state church or take away the people's right to worship. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the right for people to peacefully assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Those things, very important. So Congress cannot take away the people's right to worship God. The citizen is guaranteed the right to for free speech and press, and to meet together in a peaceable manner, and to petition the government for any right or wrongs. That's the First Amendment. The Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A militia is an army of citizens, and they're not talking about the National Guard or anything. They're talking about a militia, army of citizens, rather than professional soldiers. And the people are permitted to keep their guns, to keep their arms, right? Second Amendment rights, that the government cannot come and take your guns. The Third Amendment. The Third Amendment, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in manner to be prescribed by law. The government cannot force people or force soldiers into your house. Can't say, these soldiers are coming through, they need to all stay, and you need to take care of them and feed them in your house. They cannot do this. The quartering of the soldiers cannot be done. Back then, the British soldiers would come forth and make all of the homes, the people's homes, flood their homes with soldiers, and the people had to take care of the soldiers and sleep in their beds, and have them sleep in their beds or take care of them and everything. I say sleep in their beds because racially they had to come and, treat them, as their guest without wanting to. But that's quartering of soldiers. So quarters, that's their quarters. Okay, the Fourth Amendment's pretty important. All these are in 1791 because of the Bill of Rights. The right of persons to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and shall not be violated, and no warrant shall be issued but upon probable cause, supported by the oath or affirmation. Anyway, a person and his home or property may not be searched. They can't just come, the police or whoever just can't come and search your house without a search warrant. They need to have a search warrant, and these warrants must be reasonable. So the judge must issue a warrant before they can come in and search your house or search anything of yours. So that's search and seizure. That's the Fourth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment, basically, you can read it over here. A person cannot be brought to trial unless a grand jury has examined the evidence and deemed it necessary. So if a person is charged with a crime, that person, cannot be go to trial unless the grand jury looks and says and examines the evidence and says, yes, this person needs to go to trial, or say, no, they did not do it. We don't see any evidence here. The person is set free. So that's what a grand jury does. A grand jury does not have a trial, a trial jury. The grand jury just looks at evidence to see if there's enough evidence for that person to go to trial. No person may be tried for the same crime twice. So if you've already gone through a trial and you're innocent, you can't go have another trial, the same crime the same crime that you had committed. So no one can be forced to testify against himself. You can't be forced to testify against yourself. No one can be punished or fined unless he has been given a fair trial and found guilty. They can't punish you. They can't fine you unless you've had a fair trial and you are convicted and found guilty. So you can't go out and, they used to just go out and put you on the whipping post, even if you didn't have a trial. Now they can't do that. They can't punish you. No private property can be taken for government use unless the owner has been given a fair price for his property. So the government cannot come in and say, oh, we're going to take your property without paying for your property. It's called eminent domain. So eminent domain means to say that the government needs that for like a dam or their railroad. They come in with eminent domain. You have your property there. So they can come and take your property, but they have to give you that good price for your property. Amendment 6. The Sixth Amendment. When you look at these amendments, I always look at Amendment 5, 6, and 7. All have to do with basically juries and trials and such in those. These three, actually almost 4, but these 3 especially. Basically the Fifth Amendment has to do with whether you could be trialed, and the Sixth Amendment talks about it too. So does the Seventh. But the Sixth Amendment is one who is accused of a crime is guaranteed. Sixth Amendment says you're guaranteed fair and speedy trial. They can't put your trial on for 25 years, put you on trial. Has to be a fair and speedy trial before impartial witnesses of a jury in the state or district in which the crime took place. So if there's a crime, it has to be in the state where the crime was, and it has to be fair, with a fair jury that's impartial, and a speedy trial, not going on. When you go back in history, sometimes they'd put people in jail for years and years and years before they'd even go to trial. So you can't do that. The right, B here, right here, the right to know the charge against him. So if you are charged with something, you have a right to know what you're charged by. It used to be, we charge you for this, but they don't tell you, and they just say that you're guilty. You don't even know what's wrong, but you have the right to know the charge against you. The right to hear witnesses' testimony. So you have the right to hear the witnesses that testify against you, and jury, or with a jury there, or with a judge, and help in securing witnesses with testimony in your favor. You could, if you're defending yourself, you basically can have a lawyer who will get witnesses for your side too. So you can have help in securing witnesses for your side of your testimony. The help of a court-appointed lawyer if he cannot afford to pay. If a person comes in and he cannot afford to pay for a lawyer, then the court will appoint a lawyer for you. So that's all in the Sixth Amendment. Like again, we have the trial grand jury trial, and not testify against yourselves, all in the Fifth. The Sixth goes on to these. These 2 amendments kind of go together, the Fifth and Sixth. The Seventh Amendment, the only difference about the Seventh Amendment is it's in civil cases. It's not criminal cases. So both of these amendments, Amendments 5 and Amendment 6, are about criminal cases. If you're charged with a criminal crime, a felony crime. The Seventh Amendment has to do with civil cases between 2 people and money. So one person suing another person, because he feels that they didn't pay him enough, or it has to do with this. Well, the Seventh Amendment says all civil suits involving $20 or more. So you can't have a court case with less than $20. Well, that's not very much anyway, but you can't say, oh, I'm taking them for court for $1, so anyway. And it may be contested before a jury trial, but you can say, oh, we don't want a jury trial, we'll stand before a judge. But you have a right for a jury in any of these civil suits. Civil suits have to do between 2 different people that are suing over money or property or something. They're not criminal. Amendment 7 is not a criminal case. So, Amendment 8. has to do with that too, in a way. A person accused of a crime may have someone put up bail. They'll put up bail, money that you put aside. So the bail is the sum of money set by a judge that will get the accused temporarily released from jail. So you're in jail, and they'll set up bail money so that if you do decide to run, they'll take your money and then they'll run after you. So anyway, bail, fines, and punishes may not be excessive. So this has to do with bail. Amendment 9 is kind of a weird amendment, but it says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall be construed to deny or disparage of others retained by the people. So what does this mean? It means it was impossible to list all the rights of the people. We could go on forever and list tons of rights of the people, but this amendment assured the people that they would have not to surrender their rights just because they're not listed. So a right's not listed here. You don't have a right of this. You don't have this right. Well, it's not listed in these rights, so you don't have it. Basically saying there are other rights that are not listed, and you don't have to surrender your right just because they're not listed here. So they wanted to make sure they covered everything, right? Amendment 10 is very important, and nowadays basically not followed. Let's just see. Amendment 10 says the powers that are not specifically given to the federal government, that's our federal national government, and those powers not withheld from the states by the Constitution are reserved for the states. This is for the states, basically saying if the powers for the government that are listed here, if the powers are not, then the states get it. It says if the government doesn't have power, it's given to the states. So the states basically would have the major powers. But now the government is taking all kinds of bills and everything from the states and saying the federal government's covering it instead of the states, when basically the founders did not want the federal government to have the greater authority, but they wanted the states to have more of the authority of power. So this is Amendment 10 has to do with the states' power. The states getting all the power that are not listed in the Constitution. The states get it, but they don't lately. The later amendments. So let's go on. We're going to go all the way through. There's 27 total. So we're on 11. So these are later on. This is 1795. So this was Amendment 11. So this basically is to do with the states. Kind of goes with, they had to put something else with Amendment 10. So a state cannot be sued by its own citizens or by citizens of another state or by a foreign country in a federal court. This amendment basically was modified again, and it was modified later on. But it's another power of the states, and the state cannot be sued by their own citizens and that. So this has to do with the power of the state too. So Amendment 10, Amendment 11 have to do with power of the states. Amendment 12. Okay. Amendment 12. This amendment, let's just see, has to do with the Electoral College. The electors who vote for president and vice president. Okay, it's in 1804. What was going on in 1804? That was an election that was happening between Thomas Jefferson and for president. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. For president. Well, they used to just say, okay, we're going to take all these guys, put them together, and the top guy gets to be president, and the second guy gets to be vice president. They didn't have parties. So what happened is, basically, John Adams became president, and his vice president was Thomas Jefferson. John Adams was a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson was a Democrat Republic. So they ended up having two different parties. One is president, one is vice president. They didn't want that anymore. So they put this amendment for the Electoral College and electors who vote for president and vice president. Today, the national parties nominate candidates to run for president and vice president. So their campaigns, now they put president and vice president together. That's what it is. So this has to do with the 12th Amendment. After the campaigns are conducted, the voters go to the polls and cast their ballots. The popular vote determines who shall serve as the electors in each state. This whole thing has to do with electors too. Each elector casts their separate votes and the total number of representatives. Each state sends its list of candidates with a number of votes to each president of the Senate. He opens each list before a joint Congress and votes are counted. If no president candidate receives a majority of electoral votes, the House chooses a winner from the top 3 candidates, and the members of the House vote by states, which each state getting 1 vote. If no vice president candidate receives a majority of electors, the Senate chooses a winner from the top candidates. So the 12th Amendment. It's kind of a long one, but basically it has to do with electors and electoral college and the president and vice president, quorums and such. Okay, now the amendments 13, 14, and 15 have to do with the Civil War. They're going to have to do with slavery, right? So Amendment 13 is in 1865. Amendment 14 is 1868. This is, after the Civil War. And then you'll have the Amendment 15 in let's look at the date of 15, 1870. So 1870, 1868, and 1865 after the Civil War. These are Civil War amendments. So during the time, first during the time of Abraham Lincoln. So the 13th Amendment freed the slaves with the Emancipation. The Emancipation Proclamation had freed the slaves only in the southern states. That means some of the northern states still could have slaves. So they had to put forth a 13th Amendment that made slavery impossible for the whole country. So basically said that slavery or involuntary solitude is illegal, and it freed the slaves. So Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So freeing the slaves. It just enforced the Emancipation Proclamation throughout the whole United States. Amendment 14 in 1868, basically this one is one that any civil rights amendments, even from the civil rights in the 1960s or even now, they always go back to the 14th Amendment because it has to do with civil rights. Basically says a United States citizen is anyone born, first of all, in the United States or naturalized. So it tells who a citizen is. No state may take away a person's freedom or property without due process of law, and each state law must be affect everyone within that state the same way. That's the first part. Then it goes on and says every citizen of a state is to be counted in apportioned and representatives. If a state fails to allow all of its citizens to vote, that state's representative in Congress is to be cut. The provision has never been used. So anyway, going on here, we have an Amendment 26 for some changes here, but on to if anyone who has taken an oath to uphold and support the Constitution has participated in a revolution or war against the United States, that person cannot hold public office. This was to prevent many leaders of the southern states from taking positions of leadership. So after the war, it's basically setting forth the rights of a citizen. Basically, the Amendment 14 is saying these freed slaves, they have the rights of being citizens. If they were born in the country and they were born as a slave, they are now free and they are citizens of the United States. So Amendment 13 basically frees slavery. Amendment 14 says that they're citizens now. So, and they add, when they say Amendment 26 actually says anyone over the age of 18. So right here it says any male inhabitants of each state being 21 years of age and citizens of the United States in any way abridged. So there were still, women were not considered citizens, and still, if you're 18, you're not a citizen. But any freed slaves, men, at this time were to be citizens. So Amendment 13, again, is the Emancipation Proclamation in all the states. Amendment 14 is the right for citizenship. What a citizen is, and that a freed slave would be a citizen if he was, of course, a male, and he was over the age of 21 at this point. Now, we're going to have some more amendments that have to do with women in, and also for over the age of 18. So. Also, the 14th Amendment upheld the national debt, but the Confederate debt was voided. So it's talking about how they're going to deal with these Confederate states after the war. Basically saying, that they wouldn't be allowed if they had debts and such, that they weren't going to pay the North was not going to pay the debts to the South. They were voided. So basically saying the Confederate debt was voided. That means and was not to be paid. So basically the North did not have to pay any debts to the Confederate states. And the owners of slaves were not to be compensated for the loss of their slaves. So when their slaves were set free, they were not to give money for those slaves to be set free. That's what they said. It goes on and says, Congress is named as the supreme definer, the guardian, and the rights created by this amendment. Basically say Congress is going to go through, and the 14th Amendment has been used in a lot of areas of citizens' rights, and the rights for minorities and such. So that's all goes back to the 14th Amendment. And that was, what were they going to do with all these freed slaves? They were going to be able to be regular citizens, right? Amendment 15 in 1870 was right after this, and this basically said that no state can deny any citizen the right to vote. So, because of his race, color, or previous servitude. So, this was designed to ensure that Black Americans would have the privilege of vote. So, we had 13 freed the slaves, 14 made them citizens, 15 gave them the right to vote. So, 16th Amendment. Now we're going to another area. So, it was 1870, we're going to go clear up to 1913. So 1913, Woodrow Wilson was president, and he decided that he needed to take money from the rich and give to the poor in some way, but he put forth the 16th Amendment, which was our income tax that we have today. So this gave Congress the right to tax personal income. Congress could not tax people. And so this gave the right to tax they could tax states, but they could not tax people. And so this gave gave right to tax personal income from any source. So income tax does not have to be proportionate to the census. So basically, income tax, they can tax your income, now. So how much you make, if you make more, you're going to pay more taxes. That's Amendment 16 is income tax. Amendment 17, again, was during this same period. And the 17th Amendment provides for the direct election of senators. So under the law, the state's voters may fill a vacancy by special election, or the governor of each state, with the legislature's permission, may appoint someone to fill the vacancy until the election takes place. So when we talk about the 17th Amendment, you're going to be talking about the Senate. And so this was important too, as for the Senate. For basically, let's read the part of it, because I don't think this doesn't really tell you exactly what you need to know. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof. Now, before this time, the people didn't elect the senators, the states appointed the senators. So now that the people would elect the senators. That's the big thing. And each senator have 1 vote, and the electors in the state shall have the qualifications. Okay, basically just know the 17th Amendment has to do with the senators being elected, not chosen. Okay, you didn't know that. So basically this has to do with the senators, election of senators. Now we could go and vote for which senator we wanted. Before this time, they didn't have to vote. The state governments could just choose a senator. The 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating beverages is made illegal. Later on, it was made legal by the 21st. The 18th Amendment was prohibition. No alcohol. Alcohol would be illegal. That's 18th Amendment. But they did set a special time limit for the states to ratify it. The thing about the 18th Amendment was that the states all were into it. They're like, yes, they ratified it right away. And they set a limit to see if the states really were going to go through, and they did. So at this time, prohibition was a big thing with alcohol prohibition. Most of the states went ahead and ratified it right away. You'd think not because of alcohol, but they did. Not until FDR, Roosevelt, did he decide to change back this amendment from the 18th. And he was very much of a drinker, let's just say that. The 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment extended the right to vote to women. So women can vote now. It's 1920s, the roaring 20s, and now women want to vote. And before this, a lot of states did give them the right to vote, like Wyoming did, and a lot of the western states gave women right to vote. But now all women in every state would have the right to vote in elections from 1920. Then 1933, this was a lame duck. This is the 20th Amendment is the lame duck. Basically, before previous years, members of Congress who had been defeated at the polls met in short sessions of Congress before the new Congress took over. So what happened is the election was in November, and they wouldn't take their positions until March. And so from November to March was considered lame duck, because whoever's in office knew he's just got to get his stuff and get out by March. So they said, no, instead, we are going to change this to January 3rd. So the president and vice president would be able to take their inaugural address on January. They don't have to wait till March. This was during the time of FDR. So in this time, with Franklin, Delaware, and Roosevelt, during this time, right after that, during this time, they basically said no more lame ducks, no more lame duck time. Okay? So it said the new term of Congress begins at noon on January 3rd, not March. It also says if the president-elect dies or is disqualified, the newly elected vice president would become president, right? If the president has not been chosen by January 20th, the vice president acts as the president until the president is qualified, right? Okay, that just gives it a little bit in iffy situations. So that's the 20th. Just think, 20th is a lame duck. Let's go to the 21st. Basically, the 21st Amendment repealed the Amendment 18 of Prohibition and said, okay, alcohol is not illegal anymore. And it protected the rights of any states which had laws prohibiting intoxicating beverages. So if a state had a law that said against alcohol, the government said, no, alcohol is going to be legal, so. This amendment had to be ratified by conventions in the states, so they did that. Just think that's the saying alcohol is legal again. Amendment 22, 22nd Amendment. This limited a president to 2 terms. This is in 1951. So we're talking 1950s. What happened is that FDR, Franklin Delaware Roosevelt, the 32nd president, he was elected for 4 terms, a long time. And it basically said no more 4 terms, that a president can only be in 2 terms. He can't go on for 4 terms anymore. So, and it basically said 4 terms, that no more than 4 terms. It says if a person serves more than 2 years of the former president, he may be elected to only 1 term. This would not apply to President Truman, who was anyway. It just basically says, that now the president is limited to 2 terms or 10 years. Let's just say that. That's limited. Amendment 22 has to do with the president only being in 2 terms now. So president now, like Obama, he was in 2 terms. He couldn't run another term for president. So Amendment 23. So this is just an amendment that has to do with the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., that they wanted to vote in the presidential elections, so they needed an electoral college. So they were given what the least state would have. They were given 3 electors for the electoral college. So now, if you lived in, before that time, if you lived in Washington, D.C., you couldn't vote. You didn't have any, your votes for electoral college wouldn't count. So this is just saying, yeah, Washington, D.C., even though it's not a state, it's going to get some electorate in the electoral college to be able to vote for president. So pretty important. That's not until 1961, for goodness sakes. But anyway, so Amendment 24, this amendment we don't hear very much, but poll taxes were declared illegal. What's a poll tax? When in certain poor areas, especially, when you go to vote, you would have to pay a tax to vote. Well, especially a lot of the freemen, African Americans, were very poor at that time, and they couldn't afford to pay a tax to vote. So they said, poll taxes are illegal. You can't, say, you can't vote unless you pay us a tax. So poll taxes were made illegal. That was in 1964, another one, for goodness sakes. But back in the 1960s, there were a lot of prejudiced people against Black people voting. And so they said, we're setting, poll taxes are legal. You don't have to pay money to vote. Amendment 25, important amendment too. You don't hear about this one very much, but it's in 1967. And this, I think of 1967, what happened, and then Nixon resigned as president, and so did his vice president Agnew. And so they're like, who's going to become president? But basically it emphasized that if the president dies or resigns, the vice president does become president. And if there's no vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who will be confirmed by a majority vote in both houses. So the vice president resigned, so President Nixon appointed vice president. And then at that point, he resigned. And so that's how President Ford became president, is because of this whole amendment that had to do with the succession from if a president's not there, then the vice president, and then the who's going to be, it says whether it's going to be the president pro tempore of the Senate, the Speaker of the House. This kind of decides on all those issues they didn't know about during the Watergate of Nixon. And it goes on here. It all has to do with the succession of the vice president in Amendment 25. You can read this over. I'm not going to read it to you, but that's what it has to do, is who's going to be president. If the president resigns, the vice president, then who's going to become president. So Amendment 26 is very important to you guys. Why? Because it basically changes the age to vote. Vote before this time, you had to be 21 years old. But after Vietnam, because a lot of 18-year-olds went to Vietnam and fought in the war, and they thought if 18-year-olds have to fight in the war, they should be able to vote. So the Amendment 26 in 1971, during this time of the Vietnam War, they said that 18-year-old, if you're 18 years old or older, you're given the right to vote in both state and federal elections. Gives the 18-year-olds a right to vote. In that time period, like after in Vietnam, when they were sending so many. Amendment 27 here. And this one basically says any changes that Congress makes in the salary cannot be effective until after the next election. So basically saying, okay, so if Congress goes in, they're all voted in, they can't set their own salaries. You have to wait till the next Congress. You can't just say, okay, let's all set a salary here. We all want more money. You can't do that. That's all that says. And that's the 27th Amendment. So that goes on. Okay. Here's the Declaration of Independence. You need to read this. I'm not going to read it, but it's so important that you know what the Declaration of Independence says. And it's right in your book. And I would like to read it, but I'll let you read it. It's kind of the Declaration of Independence, important. And these are the signers of the Declaration of Independence. This is before the Constitution. The Constitution wasn't until 1789. The Declaration of Independence, of course, was in 1776. In between that time, they had did not have a constitution. yet. They were under the Articles of the Confederation during that, between 1976 and 1989. In 1989, George Washington became the first president. But these are the signers here, you can see. And of course, who would you say was the writer of the Declaration of Independence? I definitely would say had a lot to do with Thomas Jefferson. So, and here are the signers of the Constitution. Here's the Articles of the Confederation. This was before the Constitution, and it set forth, proposed by Congress, and basically gave most of authority went to the states. But the thing about the Articles of Confederation, they didn't set a national defense system. As for an army, they needed to have a stronger unity, and that's why the Constitution went in. Otherwise, we would never have survived as a country. The Articles of the... And that's the Articles. I'm not going to read all these articles because now they're all overdone in the Constitution. Okay, that's it. And you can go over this when you're doing your Constitution test. So it's very important that we know about our Constitution and we know about our rights, isn't it? And you know what? The Constitution was set forth by, godly men and men, I would say, that knew Jesus Christ as their Savior.